But anyway, so let me get started. So in the first bit, I'm gonna. I mean, I have other small things to say maybe, but anyway, let me get started. Okay, good. Okay. So the talk is about specific indefinites, and I actually don't have a lot to say about the empirical aspect of the phenomenon. So I will just very, very quickly review the key aspects. Okay, and I largely kind of presuppose that you know what I'm talking about, but maybe it's not very friendly to. I mean, I wasn't really aware what kind of group this was, so normally give this kind of talk in front of linguists, right? And they don't to learn it. So, well, yeah, let's see. So the main phenomenon that I want to talk about is so-called exceptional wide scope that indefinite exhibit, right? So I'll give you an example later on, but not only that, so this is the reason why I'm using the term specific indefinites instead of something like exceptional wide scope indefinite. And that's because I want to also understand what happens with so-called specificity marking across languages. And I don't get to say much about this in this particular talk, but rather I give you sort of a framework where we can talk about it. In particular, we want to understand what marking, like certain here in English, or the so-called differential object marking in Turkish or other Turkish languages as well, are doing, right? So if you see something like I saw a cat versus I saw a certain cat, you intuitively feel that there's a difference between them. But what does that mean in contribution? Right, and under some theories, if not all, there shouldn't actually be a truth conditional effect here. And I think that's wrong. Like we want to have some kind of interpretive difference between I saw a cat and I saw a certain cat. And so I'm developing a theory that gives you that. I think I don't have time to talk about certain today, but that's actually the interesting bit of the project. At the very end of the slides, you'll see my idea about certain. Maybe I'll just mention it very briefly at the end of the talk. Okay, so what's exceptional wide scope? So this is the main phenomenon that I want to understand, and just very briefly, for reasons of time, the fact is that indefinites seem to be able to take scope wide scope from all sorts of positions, unlike other quantifiers like every. So if you compare something like if every relative of John's dies, he'll inherit a fortune, and this is a famous example, it's not mine. Right, so you understand every in the scope of the conditional construction. But if you say if some relative of John's dies, he'll inherit a fortune, you don't need to understand some in the scope of it. Right? There's can't be a specific relative of John such that if they die, John's going to inherit a fortune, and so on and so forth. You can also show that there are other kinds of scope constraints that quantifiers generally abide by. For example, so-called scope freezing. Oh, that's the third one. Sorry. The second one has to do with negative quantifiers. I will skip these, but the fact is that indefinites can just take scope from these positions too, unlike other quantifiers. Okay. So if you're interested in the facts, you can read. There are excellent overview articles about this. I'm trying to save my time here, so just read those articles. Okay. One thing to remember again is that indefinites just take wide scope. Okay, good. So there's a lot of different theories of exceptional wide scope indefinites. People have been aware of the phenomenon since the 80s at least, maybe more, right? And there's lots and lots of different theories. Simon's in the audience, his dissertation was probably about this. And there's lots of different approaches to this phenomenon. I put the presupposition projection approach at the beginning, in part because it's one of the popular ones, but also because I want to propose a version of this. Okay, and you might have heard of choice function approaches, theories, but I don't think they are very good actually. So I will develop an alternative. I don't have time to compare different theories today. So again, if you want to know more about these theories, you have to read other things. Anyway, so this talk is about a new presuppositional theory of specific indefinites. And like I said, this is one of the popular ones in terms of the number of people who pursued it. But previous attempts largely had issues with quantification. I didn't say quantification here, but the one main issue was quantification. You kind of failed to account for the interaction with quantifiers. The source of this problem actually has to do with the theory of presupposition that people assume. And this theory is sometimes called the presupposition as anaphora theory, and sometimes as the anaphora as presupposition theory, and sometimes as the DRT theory of presupposition projection. But I think this is just not a very good theory when it comes to quantification, in my opinion. And that's where the theory fails. But the idea itself that specific indefinites have to do with presupposition, I think is actually fine. It's just the theory of presupposition that people try to make use of was not really great. So I'm gonna develop a different theory of presuppositional theory of specific indefinites using a more standard approach to presupposition, which I call the Heimstalniker view of presupposition. And in addition, I have to introduce this new trick, which I called dynamic presuppositions. Okay, so that's a takeaway of the talk. I have a sort of a new notion of presupposition, which I call dynamic presuppositions. Well, for want of a better term, really, if you come up with a better way of calling my idea, let me know. Okay, so let me introduce. Forget actually before that, right? Why do I want to pursue a presupposition approach? Well, because I think that's going to give us a handle on talking about how to describe this feeling that you get from specificity marking, right? So I saw a certain cat. Why does that sound different from I saw a cat? You actually fail to account for this if you just use a choice function, for example, right? Because if it, so maybe I can cut this, but I don't know, you mentioned it. So according to some people, this means there's a choice function f such that I saw whatever f returns when it applies to the set of cats, right? But that's truth conditionally identical to I saw a cat. So you're not really accounting for the fact that there's a you feel different about the theory. I mean, it's kind of like there's a methodological issue here, which is that we don't know what this feeling is that you're getting with the specificity marking. Like what is the people have hard time characterizing this interpretive effect certain here, right? It's like somehow there, but what is it really, like in terms of truth conditions, right? And I want to claim that this is actually a presupposition. So certain is actually an item that introduces a presupposition. Actually, I will say a bit more than that about certain. And like I said, I don't have time to talk about certain today, probably. But just to give you the basic idea, I will claim that certain actually introduces a presupposition that's about a function. And so it's not a simple specificity marker. But I think this Turkish sentence here, so the fact in Turkish is that if you have an overt accusative marker, you interpret the direct object as something specific. And I think speakers generally get this kind of feeling that there's something in the meaning here. And it's not about scope here, right? Because there's nothing to take scope over in the sentence. But nonetheless, speakers seem to think that, well, if you add the accusative marking, there's something that goes on that has to do with specificity. And we want to understand that. Okay. So that's the main sort of I mean, it's not an argument against any alternative approaches, but I just take this as one sort of a desideratum of the theories of specificity. We want to understand what's going on here. Okay, so that's my reason to pursue the presupposition approach. And in my approach, I'm going to talk a lot about anaphora and presuppositional projection, but I'm not really giving a principled account of these phenomena on their own. I mean, that's a separate task. I will assume certain things about them, right? And I will actually make use of previous theories of these phenomena. But I'm not giving you a new account of these. Rather, I'm trying to sort of combine these two things to account for specificity. And also, I don't have time to talk about all the formal details. I'm writing a paper out of this right now. It's almost done. And well, I need to write this appendix where I spell out all the formal details. And that needs to be done this summer. Hopefully, you're going to see it sometime soon. Okay. So this is the roadmap. I will first introduce this core idea, which I call dynamic presupposition. And so that's the main theoretical proposal. And then I'm going to try to explain wide scope phenomena, wide scope indefinites, in terms of presupposition projection, actually, and anaphora. And then thirdly, I will spend some time talking about quantifiers. There's actually a lot to talk about. Hopefully, I will get to the end of section 3. But this is to demonstrate that my presupposition theory is empirically, well, we can talk about quantifiers, unlike those previous attempts that kind of failed with quantification. And I wanted to demonstrate that. And the fourth point is about certain, and this is actually kind of empirically interesting. Let's see if how much time we're going to have now. Okay, so this is the roadmap. Let me start with this main theoretical idea, dynamic presupposition. So what do I mean by that? So okay, so what's a presupposition? Sorry, I'm kind of like I'm not giving you a lot of background here, but I suppose you've heard of presuppositions. And the classical idea about presuppositions, this meaning category, is that they are preconditions for truth and falsity. Right? So the presuppositions need to be true for expressions to be true or false, classical truth values. And then there's a dynamic version of this, and this is what I call Heim-Staunig or Stauninger-Heim, whichever is first. Stauninger-Heim, I'd say. The Stauninger-Heim view is a dynamic version of this, essentially. So you have to understand this in a dynamic setting. That is, you can sort of understand assertion speech acts as attempts to update the current conversational context. So that's the essential, that's the background of dynamic semantics, right? And presuppositions are preconditions for successful update. So you have to make sure that presuppositions are, quote unquote, satisfied in order for your speech act to be meaningful. Okay, so this is a dynamic version of the old Frege-Strawson view of presuppositions. So instead of talking about truth values, you're talking about updating the context. So I take this view, right? That's my starting point. And here's a simple the standard implementation of this idea, Stauninger-Heim view, right? So you have some sentence S, and let's just assume that it has some presupposition P and some asserted content A. Yes, P and A. So if you want to update C with S, I write C plus S to mean you try to update C by asserting S. And I only consider declarative sentences in this work, just to simplify. You first have to make sure that the presupposition is satisfied with respect to the current conversational context, which you're trying to update. And the standard assumption about satisfaction, presuppositional satisfaction, is that the presuppositional content has to be somehow redundant in the current conversational context. So the presupposition has to be a redundant piece of information. Right? And then if that's the case, then you can update the context with the asserted content of S. Right? If not, if P is not satisfied, then your speech act is infelicitous, so we can represent it with a symbol. Okay. And there's some technical work on this. So Heim developed a version of dynamic semantics in her dissertation, where she said redundancy amounts to something like this, but maybe I should skip the technical details here. Well, we kind of need some of this. So her proposal was that the context is a set of word assignment pairs, right? And then you evaluate redundancy in the setting as here, but I think I don't need to read the technical definition. What's important is that the presupposition, according to this view, has to be sort of already assumed to be true. So that's what it means to be redundant with respect to the context of utterance. It has to be sort of unremarkably true. Okay, so this is the standard implementation of the Staunig or Heim view of presuppositions. And I'm trying to change this a little bit. And here's the change that I propose. So as before, we check if the presupposition is satisfied, that is, if the presupposition is redundant with respect to the input context. Right? But in addition to that, I allow myself to use the content of the presupposition to update the context. Right? Then after that, you update the context with A. Okay, so this is a sort of a sequential update. You update the context with P, and they update with context A. Right, so that's the main technical proposal that I'm making here, and I call such a presupposition a dynamic presupposition. I mean, I'm going to claim that all presuppositions are like this. Okay, so what does it mean to use the presuppositional content to update the context? Right, because if you think about it, I mean, I didn't really explain redundancy in technical in detail, but if you think about it, if P is redundant already in C, updating with C with P shouldn't have any effect, you might think, right? And that is indeed true if, oh, sorry, so yeah, P has two functions here, satisfaction check, and then you, if P is satisfied, you update the context. Now, so yeah, what does it mean to update the context with P? And what kind of effects should it have, right? If P is redundant, actually, you shouldn't have any effect on C, right? Well, that is true if you see P as a propositional or proposition. Because in order for a proposition to be redundant, it has to be just true in all C, and you're not adding any more information by updating C with P. So P is actually, whenever P is redundant, that is satisfied with respect to some context C, P has to be propositionally vacuous. So there's no propositional content coming from P. Again, there's nothing new from P. But P may be actually anaphorically non-vacuous. So you could introduce, for example, a discourse on referent in its content. So a discourse referent is not part of the propositional content. You're saying that I have a new discourse referent that I can refer back to later in the sentence or later in the discourse. And I claim that that's exactly what's happening with specific indefinites. Okay. So, I actually raised in my previous work with my colleague / former student / friend, Patrick Elliott, we raised evidence for dynamic presuppositions from sentences like these. So let me explain these sentences. The phenomenon is this. So you have something like, well, you have a sentence that could introduce a discourse reference. So there's a philosopher in the audience. There's an indefinite, and by assumption, an indefinite can introduce a discourse referent. It's important to note that if you have something, there is a philosopher in the audience, this indefinite cannot take wide scope. Right? The scope is kind of fixed by there is. So it has to be narrow scope. This is crucial. However, on top of that, you have negation. So either something that doesn't know or is unaware. So you have a negative operator coming on top. And that should kill this, or that should shield the discourse referent from outer access. And that usually happens across sentences. Negation is an operator that kind of masks the discourse reference introduced in its complement. However, in this sentence, you can refer to this philosopher later on. So Daniel doesn't know that there's a philosopher in the audience, but he clearly saw her. It's not crazy, and you refer to the philosopher by heart. I think that interpretation is possible. This is much harder with something like think. The Daniel doesn't think that there's a philosopher in the audience, but he clearly saw her. What does that mean, right? I mean, maybe it's actually slightly possible, but it's not great. And we understood this contrast as suggesting that if you have a factive presupposition here, so no is a factive predicate, unaware is a factive predicate, you're projecting this presupposition that the factive presupposition, that the complement clause here that I highlighted is true. And that's introducing a discourse referent, which is a philosopher. But then you have to allow this presuppositional content to introduce a discourse referent. And that's what I call a dynamic presupposition. So this factive presupposition projects out and introduces a discourse referent. And in the second sentence, you don't have a factive presupposition, and that's what makes a crucial difference. Because you're not introducing a discourse referent in a position that's accessible to the pronoun. Okay? So this is independent evidence for dynamic presuppositions. So if anything, I'm not giving sort of more evidence for the existence of dynamic presuppositions, but I'm going to make use of this idea to account for specific independence. Okay, good. Let me just skip this slide to save time, and then explain how I do specific indefinites in this setting. Okay, but again, the main message is that we want to have dynamic presuppositions, and I invite you to think with me like how to use dynamic presuppositions to understand natural linguistic phenomena. So today I'm going to just talk about specific indefinites. Okay. So, okay, this is the analysis part of the talk, and it's a little technical because I have to use dynamic semantics to talk about this idea. I mean, I already started talking about dynamic semantics, but I'm going to use what I call a lifted version of DPL. If you don't know what this is, don't worry. All you need to know is these three things here. All right, so I'm going to use those fat brackets as the interpretation function, the maps formula, which looks like a predicate logic formula, but crucially, it's interpreted as a function over context. So this is what's called a dynamic logic. And then you're going to see a lot of existential quantifiers. So there is an X, but you should understand this informally as something that introduces a discourse referent X. Okay? So this says something like, I'm going to introduce a discourse referent X. Okay? And then you can keep talking about X. And this equivalence here, the third bullet, is actually quite important. So in this formula, there exists an X is taking scope below the conjunction, but it behaves as if it takes over it. And this is a general property of this class of dynamic semantics. And the idea is that this is interpreted as a sequential update from the first with the left conjunct and then the right conjunct. And importantly, this is allowing you to bind the second occurrence of X, because the first conjunct says, I'm going to introduce a discourse referent X, and that satisfies its predicate F. And the output of that update is going to contain this discourse referent. So the second conjunct can make use of that discourse referent. So this means exactly the same thing as this formula where the existential quantifier overtly takes scope over the conjunction. So there's no meaning difference. This idea is important, so keep this in mind. So in a way, the existential quantifier can extend its scope to the right. Okay, so that's a mechanism that I'm going to make use of. Okay, that's all you need to know pretty much. Oh, there's another, small assumption. I mean, this is a convention that I will assume this tentatively in a way, because I think this clarifies the presentation. But there might be other ways of doing this, but I will assume this. So I will represent the presuppositional content and the asserted content of a given sentence separately in terms of different formulas. Okay. So I just treat as if there are two different dimensions of meaning. Many people don't like this. I'm spending some time here because many semanticists don't like this. They do a bidimensional theory of presuppositions. They want to put the two dimensions of meaning in one formula. Maybe there's a way to do that while having dynamic presuppositions, but I will put that as an open question at the moment. I will just, because this makes my life easier. Okay, so let's start talking about indefinites. So first of all, I will assume that there are plain and specific readings of indefinites, and I will use some toy examples to illustrate. So let's start with a plain indefinite, right? So something like the sentence here is a train, plain indefinite, arrived, okay? And I analyze it in a classical way. So it just says there's a discourse referent, number 8, which is a train, and it arrived. And that's the meaning of it. And there's no interesting presupposition, so I just pretend that there's no presupposition to talk about. So it's a tautology. I mean, you can have other presuppositions, but yeah, let's say tautology. Okay. So this is the plain indefinite for me. And then the specific version of this is slightly different from this, in that you're going to move the existential quantifier to the presupposition. So that's on the next slide. Okay, so now in the presupposition, you say there is a train. Then in the asserted content, you say it arrived. And this actually makes sense in my framework, right? Because first of all, you have to check if this presupposition is redundant. That is, more specifically, propositionally redundant. And it's often redundant when you say, I mean, this is just saying there is a train. So trains exist is all you presuppose. And that's a very weak presupposition. You often assume that, as a matter of fact. Right? So it's a very easy presupposition to satisfy. And once you check the satisfaction, you can move on to the update. And according to the recipe, you use the presuppositional content first to update C. And that introduces the discourse referent 8. Right? Because it's saying there is an 8, X8, which is a train. So the presuppositional content is telling you that there is a discourse referent to talk about. And then the asserted content says that thing, number 8, arrived. And like I said, so I actually have okay. So the sequential update part here on the left really is the same thing as what happens with a plain indefinite. It's just you have two different clauses, but like I said earlier, it doesn't matter in a dynamic logic, right? This is exactly the same thing as there exists an X taking scope over both of these contents. Right? It's the same update effect as before. It's just that you have this presupposition that the trains exist, and that's a super weak presupposition. Okay, so just to put all these things on one slide. With a plain indefinite, you have no presupposition. With a specific indefinite, you have this dynamic presupposition that introduces a train in the discourse. And the assorted content refers to it. Okay? And crucially, the update effects are the same. It's just the second sentence, the specific indefinite reading, gives you a presupposition that trains exist. Right? That's the analysis, really. Okay. And it's very hard to find direct evidence for this analysis about this presupposition. Like, how do you detect this presupposition that there is a train, right, for this particular sentence? It's actually kind of hard because even the first plain reading presumably has some kind of pragmatic effect that you're talking about trains somehow. So maybe you pragmatically presuppose that it's a unremarkable thing anyways, right? Because otherwise you would say, you know, there's a train out there and it arrived. It is presumably what you would say if this the existence of trains was a remarkable thing, right? So it's kind of hard to find evidence for this, but I claim that basically projection, so when you embed the sentence in more complex environments, will give us some evidence for this. Okay. But before we get talking about projection, here's some quick remarks. So now I'm giving a semantic difference between the plain reading and the specific reading. So I can say something about this feeling that we get with specificity marking in very simple sentences, like Ali bought one book in Turkish, right? Namely, that's giving you a presupposition, right? So without the specificity marker, you don't have the presupposition. With the specificity marker, you have a presupposition. So that explains that the meaning, you feel that the meaning is different. Crucially, I claim that this is a presupposition. And I think I need to be more serious about Turkish and other languages to see if this is really true. But that's something I want to do next. Yes, I'm not very serious about Turkish per se. Like there are some Turkish speakers in the audience, I think, but I mean online at least, and they should tell me if I'm completely crazy or not. Okay, but good. At this point, I don't have a lot to say, but empirically, it seems that there are indefinites that prefer to have plain readings. I don't have much to say, but I can just say that for whatever reason, they prefer to have non-presuppositional readings, right? And maybe their constructions and things like that really force a plain reading for whatever reason. And that's a property of these constructions. So, but the point is that under my framework, they are about presuppositions. So you might be able to analyze them in these terms. Third point, again, is also kind of a side note, but there's what's called a domain specificity in addition to the kind of specificity I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about domain specificity, which is about the domain of quantification. Sometimes you're specific about the domain of quantification instead of the indefinite itself, what's quantified itself. And in different languages, maybe you actually might mark this potentially in the same way as the kind of specificity I'm talking about, but yeah, I'll put this domain specificity aside. Anyway, so what's nice about this idea that specific indefinites are presuppositional is that you get wide scope for free via presupposition projection, which we need anyways. Okay, so I will demonstrate this with two constructions. The first one is negation. Okay, so this is a sort of easy, well, this is a illustration of the meaning of negation that I assume. So negation, well, so here I can't really talk about all the compositional details, so I just assume that negation is a sentential operator. It's possible to develop a sort of a sub-sentential compositionality in this framework and talk about the VP level of negation, but I just don't have time for that today. So I just assume that not applies to some sentence. And what it does is that it negates the asserted content. So you have the negation in the translation of the asserted content. In the certain dimension, but you don't have negation in the presupposition. And this is an empirical fact about negation, right? Negation is what's called a presupposition pole. So it passes the presupposition of its complement to the next level. And it only negates the asserted content. So I assume that negation does this, and this is a technical way of defining negation, but I will not dwell on it. What's important is that the P here is preserved, right, from the original sentence. So now suppose that you put the simple sentence, a train arrived under negation, right? So to simplify my presentation, I will consider this almost ungrammatical sentence, not a train arrived, because I'm not very serious about this particular sentence per se. I'm just illustrating the idea, right? Just to avoid all these other complications that would arise with more natural examples. I just stick to this. So what the prediction here is that if you have a plain indefinite, you're going to negate the entire thing, okay? And there's no presupposition to talk about, and it projects. So the presupposition is basically null here. And you get the negation on top of the operator that introduces a discourse referent. And effectively, this meaning doesn't entail that there's a train. Okay? And that's the narrow scope reading, essentially. Okay? I mean, it means there's no train that arrived, but that doesn't entail that there's a train. Okay? If you do this with a specific indefinite, then what you're negating is the asserted content only. So you negate arrived. But the presupposition that there's a train is going to project out. And the consequence, right, the reading amounts to something like this. So you first say there's a train because that's the presupposition. And then you say it didn't arrive. And that's a wide scope reading. Right? There's a train such that it didn't arrive, and that's why it's close. And the point here is that you get this out of presupposition projection. you're not doing anything in the syntax or anywhere else. You just do this via presupposition projection. Okay. So you clearly have different entailments here. With the plain indefinite, you don't entail that there's a train. With the plain indefinite, you do. In fact, you require that the propositional content of the presupposition be satisfied with respect to the current context. Right? And the propositional content is that trains exist. Good. I can illustrate the same thing with material conditional, but I think, I mean, it's the same point, except that the sentence is more natural. So I will maybe just skip this. The point that I wanted to make here is that if you have a specific indefinite in the antecedent of the clause, its presupposition is gonna project, because that's how presuppositions work in conditional antecedents, right? So you're gonna end up entailing that there's a train. If you have a plain indefinite, you're not gonna have this inference. So, okay, so I will skip this. Okay. Okay, good. So, yeah. So that's my account. So you do presupposition projection, and you get your wide scope almost for free. There's one thing to note, which is about crossover, and I don't have a full answer to this. But the observation is this. So if you take a sentence like this, it's Ona fed a cat. It's very hard to bind it from, well, with the indefinite. But if you think about like how I would analyze this sentence with a specific indefinite, it's going to say there is a cat. That's the presupposition. And then the assertion is going to say its owner fed it. So there's no reason why I cannot bind it, because the presupposition projects out of this, right? Almost compositionally. But the fact seems to be that there's a restriction here. And this kind of pattern is called weak crossover. And in this paper that I mentioned earlier, that I wrote with Patrick Elliott, we actually focused on this phenomenon. So like I said, you can say Daniel is unaware that there's a philosopher in the audience, but he clearly saw her. We pointed out in this paper that this also triggers weak crossover effects. So here, the idea is that this is a factive clause, so you project this presupposition that there's a philosopher in the audience, and that allows you to introduce a discourse referent, which her refers to. But if that's the case, right, you would expect something like her supervisee is unaware that there's a philosopher in the audience to be able to have a bound reading of her, because there's a philosopher in the audience who's going to project up to the topmost level, essentially. And then there's no reason why her cannot refer to the philosopher. But the fact seems to be that you can't do this. So what this is telling us, I think, is that we want to develop a general notion of crossover, a general theory of crossover that not only targets basically quantifier scope, but also what happens with presuppositions. And we don't claim to have a theory like that yet, but that's what we want to have at the end of the day. And with that theory, which doesn't exist yet, I'm not going to run into an issue here. Okay. So this is something we all should think about, in my opinion. And we don't have a very, I mean, we made a suggestion in this paper. Very interesting. Okay. So good. So again, this idea of dynamic presuppositions allows me to have an existential quantifier, which introduces the discourse referent, in the presupposition, and I can just use the standard mechanism of projection, presupposition projection, to give it a wide scope. Projection just carries the existential quantifier with it, right? And it just projects to wherever it has to project. Okay. So that's really the idea, and the rest is sort of a bit of technical details. And like I said, those previous attempts to do something similar failed with quantification. Right? And I want to sort of briefly demonstrate that I can do better with this framework of projection. So I'm kind of wondering what to do because we don't have a lot of time left. Anyway, let me start talking about this and someone can stop me. So. Okay, so right. So what I want to demonstrate is that my theory actually can deal with quantifiers better than the previous presuppositional theories. And I think I'm kind of convinced of this. I'm at least better, if not perfect. Right? So I can talk, but I have to actually make some technical assumptions that I don't really anyway have time to explain in full detail today. But I will try to say what the ideas are. Okay. Let's start with the nuclear scope of every. So what happens with the presupposition triggered in the VP position of a sentence like every cat block? Right? So I'm using cat because I assume the cat doesn't really introduce a presupposition on its own. And so I can just forget about what would happen if a presupposition is triggered in the restrictor. Right? So let's just take every cat as a unit. The first thing to note here is that every introduces an existence presupposition. So I write it like this. So there is a cat, right? That's the existence presupposition. I have there's a little arrow in front of it because for whatever reason, you can't refer to this cat. Right? And that's an interesting effect. And actually, the final form of this, I get rid of this arrow in the end, but I don't think I will get there today. So that's just simple. So anyway, so you have some existence, an existence presupposition of this kind. Okay, that just seems to be a fact. And then the rest of the presupposition here is that that says that every cat satisfies the presupposition triggered in the VP. And that seems to be generally the case. So people tend to assume this semantics for every. Right. And in the assertion, you just say every cat satisfies the assertion of the VP. Right. So the important bit is this projection bit. Yeah. Okay. So what happens with a specific indefinite? So this is a plain indefinite, so nothing interesting. So with a plain indefinite, the VP saw a mouse with a plain indefinite presupposes nothing. Let's say nothing. I mean, maybe presupposes that the subject is a sentient being or whatever, but let's just forget about that. Then this projected presupposition is essentially, isn't saying much. It's almost a tautology basically. Well, given that there are cats, it's basically a tautology. I mean, without cats, too, I guess it's true. So it's a tautology. All right. So it's a tautology. Right. So you basically only perceive the existence presupposition. And then the assertion is for every cat, there's a mouse that you saw, and that's a narrow scope, really, essentially. Right? So what would happen with a specific indefinite? And I run into an issue here. Why? Well, because now the presupposition says every cat satisfies the presupposition of the VP, and the presupposition of the VP contains that there is a mouse, which is fine. So the presupposition now says for every cat, there is a mouse. Potentially the same one, who knows, right? Maybe different ones for different cats. But crucially, in the assertion, I have to say for every cat, the following is true. The cat saw it, but it here is not bound by this. So for technical reasons, in this position, which is below a universal quantifier, you can't extend the scope of the existential quantifier to bind this thing in the assertion. Okay, so this is a problem that I have to solve because I want to be able to derive a wide scope reading essentially here. So how do I get a wide scope reading? Right, so I will introduce my analysis. Okay, this is the problem. So in the assertion, you have this variable that's not bound by the existential quantifier. It's a free variable, and that's not a possible meaning of the sentence. So I want to bind it and also give the existential quantifier a wide scope. And here's my idea. I actually deny the earlier analysis of the projection property of every cat. So before we said this part, the projection part of the presupposition is a universal statement. But now I'm saying, no, actually it's not. It means the cats. So this is a plural cat. Or the plurality consisting of all cats. And that has to satisfy the presupposition triggered in the VP. Okay? And the assertion is the same point. And this often gives rise to universal inference because we tend to look at examples that have distributive presuppositions. So in the case of woke up, which presupposes that the subject was asleep, or right, wake up presupposes that, right? This is a distributive property, being asleep. So if you apply that property to the plurality of cats, you just get a distributive reading that every cat was asleep. Right? So that's how you get a universal inference. So I'm using this distributivity operator in the intermediate language, which is essentially a universal quantifier, except that it operates on the plurality and decomposes it into its atomic parts and says this property holds. So why does this help us? Because it's a universal quantifier after all, right? It helps us because we can assume that the VP in question saw a mouse with a specific indefinite, just has a constant presupposition that whatever the subject is, there is a mouse. And the subject here is this plurality consisting of all cats out there. So if you apply this predicate presupposition to the plurality, you just get there is a mouse. So in other words, it's not a distributive property. It's actually a constant function, right? So as a consequence, the presupposition is going to be there. Well, there's the existence presupposition plus there is a mouse. And now I can bind my variable x7 in the assertion because there is a mouse is not within any operator, right? It's not below any operator. So it just introduced a mouse in the presupposition, and then every cat saw it. And crucially, that's a wide scope reading. Now you're saying there's a mouse, and every cat saw it. That's a wide scope reading. Things get a bit more interesting if you try to bind, or if you try to force a distributive presupposition. And that can happen in a sentence like this. Every cat ate a mouse it saw. If you say it saw, that introduces distributivity. So that forces distributivity. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to interpret it. Okay, so if you understand a mouse it saw as a specific indefinite, your presupposition is going to actually contain this distributivity operator. So for every cat, there's a mouse it saw. Now I run into the same issue as before, right? Because this is under this operator, which is actually a universal quantifier in disguise, right? And you can't bind this thing anymore. So what would I say here? I mean, you can try to say that this parse is just out and you have a plain reading instead. The plain reading will be fine. You don't run into this binding issue. Just trust me, I'm not going to show it to you, but that's the case. So you can say, okay, in this kind of example, you just don't have a specific reading. That's a possibility analytically, but I think that's not true because you can actually have specificity marking here in languages like Turkish, it seems. I don't have a very good Turkish sentence here, and some Turkish speakers don't like it, so maybe I should just skip it. But basically, if you translate the sentence in English into Turkish, you at least can and maybe prefer to have the specificity marker, which is the accusative case particle here. So I did not dwell on this too much. So I think it's desirable to be able to solve this issue. Okay? And my solution is what's called quantificational subordination. So let me talk about this for 5 minutes, okay? And then we can discuss what to do next. Okay, so here's the idea. So as a matter of fact, you can introduce an indefinite below something like a distributivity operator all, and you can refer back to it again if you have something like another distributivity operator. I mean, there are other ways of doing this, but this is at least a possible discourse in English. So the cats all saw a mouse, they all ate it. And crucially, this it is not about a single mouse, right? It can be about different mice for different cats. This has to be for each cat, it must be the mouse that it saw. Okay, so somehow you take into consideration, here you're introducing multiple mice, like one mouse for each cat, and then you sort of distribute this interpretation, the interpretation of it under all. So this is a possibility in natural language, actual natural language discourse. And I claim that that's what's happening between the presupposition and the sort of content of the example that we just saw. So technically, I adopt a theory of this phenomenon, and I don't need to adopt this theory, but for simplicity, I adopt the theory where it's the distributivity operator that enables this reading, right? And it seems that you want to have something like this distributivity operator to be able to do this in natural language. So I'm reanalyzing the assertion of every cat with the distributivity operator. So every cat ate a mouse it saw is as before. You have the distributivity operator because a mouse it saw wouldn't have a coherent interpretation otherwise. Right? So for every cat, there is a mouse it saw, is the presupposition. Then in the assertion, you have the same distributivity operator. And it says, the cat ate it. So this is exactly like this discourse in English. The cats all saw a mouse, every cat ate it, or they all ate it, if you like, right? It's just, this is the same kind of anaphora is happening between the two dimensions of meaning. That's the claim. So if you want to paraphrase this with English sentences, right, this meaning, then you're going to get basically the same thing as this discourse. And this discourse is fine with respect to anaphora, therefore, the meaning makes sense. And if you think about it, the truth conditions will be narrow scope, right? Because if you say the cats all saw a mouse, every cat ate it, you're talking about different mice for different cats, and that's a narrow scope reading. So this corresponds to the narrow scope reading, and that's what we want actually here, right? Because you never had a wide scope reading essentially for this kind of a sentence with binding. So I claim that this is a good thing. So yeah, so I can deal with examples like this. Okie dokie. All right. I will just skip this because it's not that important. And let me wrap up with, this actually doesn't really matter. Yeah, so, okay, so there's a huge section on how to do restrictor stuff, which is interesting if you are if you know this literature. So I'm not going to really talk about that. And let me just in 1 minute explain what I mention what I want to say about certain. Okay. So again, I have an account of quantifiers. If you want to know more about it, check out my paper. Should be written in a couple of months. Good. And there's one more thing that I want to say in this work, which is about certain, because certain in English is actually super interesting. And there are things that, so this has been discussed a lot in the literature. Many people have tried to understand what the meaning contribution really is. But I don't think we have a very good theory in the like empirically speaking, in the literature. And I think I have a better handle on this with this notion of dynamic presuppositions. So everyone says certain or uncertain, if you like, is a specificity marker of some kind. And there's one important thing that this is actually beyond. It seems that it's not. Its meaning contribution is beyond just marking specificity. There's something else that's going on. And one reason to think so is because you have a new reading sometimes when you have certain. So compare these two sentences from Schwartz's paper. So no boy tried every dish that a female relative of his had made. Okay, so that has some interpretation. And because of the binding between no boy and his, you don't have a wide scope reading. So it's some kind of a narrow scope reading, or something like an intermediate scope reading. But crucially, you seem to have something like a wide scope reading with certain. So no boy tried every dish that a certain female relative of his had made. You know, you have some understanding of this that A cannot mean. So this is true in a context, for example, no boy tried every dish that his mother made, but they tried every dish that their aunt made, for example. That which wouldn't be true with respect to the meaning of A. That's what A wouldn't be true in this scenario. So certain seems to be able to introduce new meaning, and what is that meaning? And in characterizing this meaning, we have this intuition that it's something about some kind of like a natural class in a way. And often there's this phrase in terms of natural functions. And I don't have a lot to say about what natural functions are, but my claim here is that certain introduces an existential quantification over natural functions. So something like mother of relation, right? So you say something like there is a presupposition of a certain train arrived would be something like there is a natural function and that's it, which is basically true all the time. Of course, natural functions exist. I mean, there are abstract entities that just exist. But crucially, this is taking scope over everything. And you mean there's a train which is the same thing as what the natural function returns with respect to this free variable, and that thing arrived. So you have a free variable here, and I assume that this can be resolved to anything that's discourse salient, typically the speaker. So when you say a certain train arrived, you often imply that you have some natural relation with respect to the train. And in the literature, people often say certain connotes that you have some specific train in mind. And I think this is what's it's captured, this analysis is capturing that intuition. The speaker is bearing some relation with the train, and that's what you mean by certain. And a bunch of interesting things happen when you have a quantifier, because you can actually bind this variable. So this doesn't need to be the speaker, it can actually be bound. So in a sentence like every cat saw a certain mouse, you can have different mice because you're binding this variable, and the natural function is returning different mice for different cats, potentially, I mean, they can overlap. And so on and so forth. And here, I hope this is going to please Simon Charlo. A guy named Mike Solomon did an excellent work on this, using basically essentially the same idea. So I'm borrowing his idea here, except that I'm proposing that there's all this function thing. Well, the part of the meaning is presuppositional, which Mike Solomon doesn't say. But he had the same kind of idea, and he makes good observations about when binding is possible and when not, because in some cases you don't get this binding reading with certain. But I have to skip that. You're interested in me? Ask me later. Okay, let me conclude. So the highlight is really this. Okay, so I wanted to say the specificity is a presuppositional phenomenon, and the key theoretical machinery is dynamic presuppositions, which is sort of a new device. And I think this helps us understand this feeling about specificity, that the speaker has something in mind. And I'm trying to develop an account of certain that's better than previous accounts. Okay, thank you.